Hey guys, today I'm going to be making a raglan sleeve 1950s blouse based on this pattern right here. I actually don't own this pattern, so I'm going to be using vintage flat pattern drafting guides, some pattern pieces from other vintage patterns in my collection, and my knowledge of pattern drafting to recreate this design in my size. I did make a few design changes, which you'll see, but let's get on with the pattern drafting. So I just drafted up these new foundation blocks. I usually use ones that I've already perfected to fit me pretty well, but I was curious to try out the standard blocks from this vintage pattern drafting guide that I found online. It's basically just a PDF of a 1939 book called Pattern Drafting and Grading by Michael Rohr. And this specific version has some amendments from I think 1961 or something like that, but it's mostly the original text. I did not mock these up because I was a little lazy, so we'll see how the blouse comes out, but I'm just going to use the provided instructions for a raglan sleeve to give these blocks the raglan shape that I want for my blouse. So first I have to trace out all of the pattern pieces that I need. This right here is just a long sleeve with a little bit of gathering around the cuff. I'm just using some books as pattern weights. This pattern came off Simplicity 4425, which is a 1940s shirt dress pattern. It's a pretty common pattern. I think it's from the mid 40s. And the sleeve on that dress is just basic, so that's why I'm using it. And it's just got that gathering along the bottom. As for alterations to this pattern, I'm probably going to slim down the sleeve cap a little bit because the shoulder here in 1952, which is the pattern that I'm trying to replicate, was not as pronounced as it was in the mid 40s, so that probably has to be taken in a tiny bit. And I'm also going to raise the armhole here a little bit. This is just a trick that I learned from Bernadette Banner's book, Make, Sew, and Mend, in order to give the armholes a bit more movement. I've done this before, and I personally don't really think it affects the look of the armhole that much, even though it does look quite drastic what I'm doing here. Also mark the center, that's always helpful. And I'll just add a little bit of paper so I could do this on the other side as well, and then I'll trace my block pattern. So when it comes to tracing my block, so I can start doing the raglan style lines, they want me to trace them so that the front and back kind of line up like this at the shoulder seam. However, being drafts, especially from 1939, these are probably pretty similar to the natural curve of the shoulder. So for example, while block patterns are supposed to be pretty true to the natural human figure, if you had a block pattern from, say, the 1920s, they might not include these darts at all because the silhouette was very straight back then. The same thing goes for maybe in 1945, they might square the shoulder more. So all that was to say, these are probably more naturally sloping shoulders. Just going to add a little bit of room between them. I'll probably shoot for around 3/4 of an inch so that our shoulder is a bit more square. Okay, that should be good. Just going to tape that in place, and hopefully I can remove the tape when I'm done so that it doesn't rip the pieces. Oh my god, I moved it already. Okay, there we go. I probably won't film this whole drafting demonstration because even though I absolutely love pattern drafting, it'll probably get a little bit boring just watching me follow someone else's instructions. But I'll film the start of it for you guys. And what's really great about this project is that I'm trying to copy it from an actual sewing pattern. And there's this website called the Commercial Pattern Archive that has some information and also pictures of the diagrams of most vintage sewing patterns. And they do have this 1950s raglan blouse pattern that I'm looking at. And so based on the shapes of the pattern pieces that they provide, I can kind of check myself as I go along just to make sure I haven't royally screwed up anything. Okay, let's remove my draft now. And I'm just going to connect these lines. I'm just going to draw a new shoulder seam with the extra room for the shoulder padding that we're going to add. So before we touch the sleeve, we're going to kind of draw a line from kind of like that to create the raglan shape on the bodice. And to do that, they say we're gonna put a dot 1/3 of the way down this armhole. So somewhere around here. This is easy enough. And we're going to do the same thing on this side, but it's going to be halfway down instead of 1/3. Now we're going to connect these points, but we're also going to curve the line a little bit. I think I'll do the rest of this off camera. Maybe I'll throw in a time lapse or something. But if you're interested in doing this for yourself, I'll leave the drafting guide linked in the description. It's a great book. I've drafted a pair of pants from it, and it fits really well. So make sure to check that out if you're interested in pattern drafting. So I've gotten a lot done since I last spoke to you guys. Basically, I just turned this block pattern into more of a blouse. So first I just transferred some of the fullness from this bottom dart into the top into gathering, and I also spread the piece as a whole just a little bit to add some ease. I also added an all-in-one facing with 3/4 of an inch of overlap for the buttons, and just this other piece that will fold back into the facing. And I also lowered it by 7 inches so that it just extends past the waist. As for the back, all I did was spread it for ease, just making sure not to disturb the neckline, keeping that preserved up there, and extending it again by the 7 inches. I also made a collar piece. I don't remember what pattern this came from, but this originally came off a commercial vintage sewing pattern, and I just traced it to add some extra length here. I'm not copying the collar design from the pattern. I'm instead going for a more late 40s accentuated collar look. And that brings us to the sleeve piece. So while I was working, I kind of remembered that since this came from a commercial sewing pattern, there was actually seam allowance incorporated inside when I did all of this. And I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes. It might not make a difference at all. I was planning not to do a mock-up and just make the final blouse, but I really should, so I think I will. I actually made a bunch of changes from the mock-up to the final pattern, and I'll tell you about them as I pin and cut the final blouse. So first, purely cosmetically, I made the raglan line straighter on the front and back, just exaggerating what I'd done when I eyeballed it in the pattern drafting. The blouse also didn't have enough ease to fit like a proper blouse, so I added a bit to the center back and also increased the amount of gathering. In the end, I might have added a bit too much gathering, but oh well. I only made one actual fit change, which I'm super pleased about because that means the draft was accurate, but ironically enough, I screwed it up. The shoulder on the blouse sat a lot closer than my actual shoulder, so I tried to extend it, but I accidentally extended it below the dart, and so while the fit improved, it still visually looks like it isn't sitting right on my shoulder. Unfortunate, but it's not a deal breaker, and I'm still really happy with this draft. Also, my apologies for this horrible lighting situation. I filmed this at night, and I didn't feel like getting my filming light, so I guess I'm paying now. I've never sewn a raglan blouse before, and I wasn't quite sure about the order of construction, so I assumed the best way to do it was to sew all of the raglan seams first, but to make that easier, I first had to sew the shoulder dart. After doing that, I could then pin and sew all of the raglan seams. I think my favorite part of this pattern is the fact that I don't have to set a sleeve. Some people really hate setting sleeves, but I don't mind it that much. It's just time consuming and tedious, and most of the time I have to unpick a section I cut a little tuck in, so it was nice to take a break from sleeve setting. At this point I tried on the blouse, even though the sleeve seams weren't sewn, and good thing I did because I noticed the sleeve was too long, so I just trimmed that down by 1 inch. I know you're not supposed to shorten and extend shaped sleeves from the bottom like this, but that was my own fault for not checking the length in the pattern drafting stage. Then I could pin the sleeve seam and stitch it, stopping about 2 inches minus seam allowance above the cuff for the opening. Next came one of my favorite parts of this project, doing the sleeve cuffs. I tried to do it like a little skirt placket, but I messed up, which you'll see. But first, I started by stitching a small strip of fabric to each side of the opening, then I folded one side back and tucked in all of the raw edges. After this is stitched in place, it just acts as finishing and reinforcement for this edge. Now, this other side is the side I messed up. I didn't make the strip wide enough, and so I wasn't able to cover all of the raw edges. It's supposed to be a flap that overlaps behind the other side of the opening, and the buttons are stitched to it so they can come through buttonholes on the outside. But since I forgot it had to be wider, I just stitched over it several times to reinforce it. And this is how it closes. I later stitched the two sides of the placket together at the base so that they overlapped correctly. Next was the sleeve gathering, which I did on my machine with a large stitch length using 2 rows of course. I used the cuff pattern that had come with the sleeve, and I kind of regret it now because it's a little tight and a lot narrower than what I'd envisioned. You can see I had to gather the sleeve nearly as tight as it would go in order to make it fit, and I'm sewing this like a collar, just without the facing. First sewing one layer to the gathered sleeve, then folding back the other layer to hide the seam allowances on the inside and top stitching that into place. Speaking of gathering, I then gathered the neckline at the collar, which is the main feature of this blouse. One side ended up sitting beautifully in 3 distinct folds, but the other side just bunches near the center front opening and I can't get it to sit nicely. Considering I didn't put any effort into arranging the gathers, I think I got pretty lucky on the first side, honestly. Next I worked on the collar. I actually forgot to mention this earlier, I guess my notes were incomplete, but I ended up changing the collar to match the pattern reference instead of going with that late 40s shape, because in the mock-up that shape ended up covering the gathering and I didn't like that. As you can see, now the collar ends at the same point as the center front. I forgot to angle the center front like the original pattern shows to eliminate the overlap for the buttons because it's not needed at the collar, so that wasn't ideal, but it's not a huge deal. Anyway, I'm sure most of you know how a collar works, but if you don't, I stitched around the edge and trimmed the corners so that they could be neatly poked out with a knitting needle, and then I'll pin it to the neckline. I actually love this collar. It's got the length of 40s collars, but it's very subtle, and something about the way it sits also works for the 50s. I must have just gotten lucky because I didn't think about any of that when drafting it. And the collar was just basted to the neckline to hold it in place while we mess with the facings in the next step. In this shot, the collar is laying on the underside so I can make sure the neckline is sitting smoothly with all of the gathering and seams and all. Then I trimmed the corner of the seam allowance on the collar so that I could fold back the all-in-one facing very crisply, which was something I was concerned about. I actually forgot to draft a facing for anything but the front edge, but I still wanted that stability all around, so being in a pinch, I cut a bias strip out of some scraps. Obviously it doesn't fit the curve of the other pattern pieces, and I was afraid you'd see its outline on the outside of the blouse, so I opted not to fill it down, which I really don't like for the durability of the blouse. It worked in a pinch, but I really have to remember my facings next time. Anyway, I just sewed straight across that top edge to secure all my facings into place. I was getting nervous about the thickness of the neckline at this point, so I trimmed it down a bit, and also turned the facings to the inside of the blouse, but it seems like I lost the footage for that. I was looking at some true vintage blouses online and noticed that most of them had tucks to neatly arrange the fullness at the waist. Most of the time, I look at sewing pattern illustrations or vintage photographs for sewing inspiration, so I didn't realize these tucks were so widespread in the actual blouses. One of the final steps was to add the buttonholes. Buttonholes stress me out, not because they're difficult, these days all you have to do is press a button, but because occasionally there's a mechanical issue with the machine or the feed dog doesn't correctly move the fabric and they get messed up. And you can't really remove a finished buttonhole either, at least not invisibly. Now that that was out of the way, I did a double fold hem along the bottom edge. While in my extant blouse internet rabbit hole, I saw a blouse that was just pinked along the bottom edge, and that particular one has survived for about 80 years, so maybe one day I'll succumb and do that too, but not today. The very last thing to do was mark the places for buttons and stitch them on. I was debating whether to use embroidery thread so that they could be colorful, but I decided not to because this was quite a densely woven cotton, which makes it very opaque, but also difficult to sew by hand. I was also a little pressed for time and didn't want to finish the blouse later, which you can probably tell in this footage. And here's the finished blouse. Overall, it's a lot more comfortable than my completely self-drafted blouse patterns, which is definitely interesting to see. I'm not that happy with the sleeves, honestly. I feel like the amount of fullness and the narrow cuff are giving 18th century men. It's not exactly what I was going for, so I like to roll up the sleeves above the elbow, which is super easy because I never put closures on the sleeves, for a more casual 40s look. But other than what I already discussed in the video, I'm very happy with this blouse. The only thing I could change is maybe lowering the tucks a tiny bit so it looks a bit more natural, but I could fix that at any time and it's not a big deal. One last thing, I made a community post about this, but I recently started an Etsy store where I sell digital downloads of vintage knitting and crochet patterns from my personal collection. They're all in the public domain and might be difficult to find online for free, especially in easily readable condition. So if you would like to support me and my channel, you can buy one of my patterns for about $1 to $2, and I'll leave the link in the description. With that bit of self-promo out of the way, thanks so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll be back for the next video.